Hello, guys. I hope you're keeping safe at home and everyone's keeping healthy. I just wish you well and good news. I hope nobody has any bad results in the tests, and I hope you're able to concentrate and work and so on. I'm going to take you through a recording now of today's class. First thing of all, I'm going to tell you where we are on the lesson plan. So we're up now, as you know, we're working on development economics. We're up as far as class number 17. Essentially, 16 and 17 together, these will cover chapter 27 of your textbook. The last day we talked about, the basics of development. What is economic growth? The graphs we use, for example, the PPC and the long-run average supply curve. Today, we're just going to talk about the developing countries, the characteristics of developing countries. What is the difference between the two? So this is something that's used quite a lot in the literature. We talk about developing countries, but there's quite a lot. I mean, it encompasses a hell of a lot of countries. So we're going to have these two. Then next Thursday, we're going to have a full class. Hopefully, we'll all be back in the classroom. We'll have a class talking about sustainable development goals. Also, what I'll do today is I'm going to make myself during the class time available on the Zoom if anyone has any questions about the I-8. Okay, so I'll send you a message on that as well. But I hope this video gives you a good overview of the chapter 27. So in terms of documents, I've uploaded these notes. They're going to be here on the notes I'm going to use. They're here underneath this here. And yeah, let's just get cracking. So economic development, chapter 27. So start off, use your imagination. Suppose you're blindfolded and airlifted abroad. After you arrive in a small town and remove the blindfold, your job is to determine the income level of the place based on only 60 seconds of observation. What would you look for? Well, perhaps some clues are, do you see trash or trash cans? Is it hot and humid? What are people wearing? How are people getting around? Do the animals look pampered? What do the streets and buildings look like? What is everybody eating? And essentially, these things here is what economic development is about. So how far has society come along? How wealthy is society? How well do they take care of people? I really like this one. Do animals look pampered? In really rich countries, people are buying jackets for dogs and sending dogs off for spa treatments and things like that. I mean, is that development? Well, I mean, that's a sign of a society that has got enough money for basic needs and wants and can use income on pure luxury goods. But think about all these different things here. These all apply to how developed a society is. Types of food we're eating. Are people eating out in restaurants? Or people just, is there no restaurants in a place? That's a sign of development. Hot and humid countries tend to be less developed than moderate countries because those moderate climate countries had a good head start with agriculture, could thrive a lot quicker, and so on. So traditional economic theory has tended to make the assumption that increased output of an economy, along with the pattern of industrialization that accompanies economic growth, is equivalent to economic development. So distinguish between economic growth and economic development. So economic growth is quite simply, we're producing more. Traditional measure, GDP goes up. Economic development is a bit broader. It's taking into account not just our wealth, but also things like our health and our education. So increased output. So traditional economic theory assumes that increased output of an economy, as well as the economy becoming more industrialized and moving into services and so on, this is what we call economic development. But economic growth is not equivalent to economic development. Economic development is a far more complex and multi-dimensional concept, and that's what we're going to talk about. So what is development economics about? Well, it's about all these different things here. So we're only going to touch lightly on economic development for the IB course, but if you go and you study at university, it's such an interesting subject and there's so much to it. So economic development is about income growth. How can we have development without growth in countries whose per capita incomes now is about $1 or $2 per day? So some people will say we don't need economic growth, it's economic development, but a counter argument is, well, if they have to survive on so little, maybe we should start with economic growth. The study of poverty and inequality. This is related to economic development, not just in poor countries, but in richer countries as well. And we link this in with the next class, we'll link this in with the Sustainable Development Goals. Agricultural economics, how to make agriculture more productive is a big question in countries where most of the population is rural and agricultural. Then things like economic demography, labor economics, and so on. All these things here, like like having good insurance and credit and so on, how this leads to economic growth, public goods and natural resources. These are all related to development economics. So just have a read through this page here. I mean, generally speaking, development economics is very, very broad. It covers a hell of a lot of stuff. For us, we're going to focus more on the relation with economic growth and essentially how have developing countries done in the past and what policies do we recommend to help them grow and become more developed. So development economics seeks to understand the economic aspects of development in low-income countries. So essentially that's where it's understanding how are low-income countries progressing. This implies there must be something different about studying economics in low-income countries. Clearly there is. Economic development entails far-reaching changes in the structure of economies, technologies, societies, and political systems. Development economics sometimes is the study of economies that do not fit many of the basic assumptions underpinning economic analysis in high-income countries, including well-functioning markets, perfect information, and low transaction costs. When these assumptions break down, so do the basic welfare and policy conclusions of economics. Well, what is this economic jargon saying? It's basically telling us that some of the things we take for granted, so in living in the developed world, the things we take for granted, so the fact that our banks work fine, the fact that we trust we're getting paid at the end of the month, these don't work in a lot of developing countries. So standard economic theory doesn't always apply because we don't have the same level of institutions or well-functioning markets as we do in the rich world. So overall, what is economic development? It's about increasing people's freedoms. It's about reducing poverty so that people can be adequately fed and sheltered. It's about the public provision of education, healthcare, and the maintenance of law and order. It is about the guarantee of civil liberties and the opportunity of civic participation. Generally speaking, if you're going to define economic development, I would focus about the reducing poverty, the basic want, reducing poverty, people getting fed and sheltered, and then talk about education, healthcare, and law and order. To me, that's the main principles of economic development. The aim of this chapter in the textbook, chapter 27, so this is your checklist. This is what you need to understand by the time you finish. Distinguish between economic growth and economic development. Know the difference between those two. Explain the relationship between them. So there is a strong positive correlation. Countries that have higher economic growth tend to have higher economic development. There are exceptions. Look at the US, the largest economy in the world, but the standard of living is not as high as in other countries. Why? I mean, challenges with the healthcare system and so on. And we might watch a video on that in a few weeks. Explain and give examples of common characteristics of developing countries. Explain and give examples of the diversity that exists between the developing countries. So not all developing countries are alike. Some developing countries have tons of resources. Some developing countries have huge populations and so on. Outline the current status of the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. So this we will cover this in the next class. We won't do that today, and we'll focus more on the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals ended in 2015. So how do economies grow? Again, know how these things impact your PPC and your ASAD. You growing your natural resources. So anything that increases the quality and quantity of your factors of production is going to help economic growth. So in your textbook, they talk about Singapore using landfills to increase their land. Also, human capital, improving your improving population size, and improving increasing your population, increasing the level of education. That's a way to increase your economic growth. Then anything that increases the physical capital and the technological. So basically, and in your textbook, we talk about things. We talk about two concepts. We talk about capital widening. So when we've been able to have extra capital used with a unit of labor. And then we talk about capital deepening, when there's an increase in the amount of capital for each worker. Sorry, capital widening is when extra capital is used with an increased amount of labor, but the ratio of capital per worker doesn't change. And then the capital deepening is when there's an increase in the amount of capital for each worker. And then also improvements in technology. So basically, any of these things here will increase economic growth. We're familiar with these from macro. So here we're just talking about either improving the quality and quantity of your factors of production and or improving the level of technology. This fourth one here is something we take for granted, but maybe not in developing countries. This is about the institutions. So what are institutions? We'll have a full chapter on institutions later, but for now, know that institutions is something like having a banking system that works, having a legal system, a good education system, having reliable infrastructure, political stability, and good international relationships. If these don't work, it's very hard for an economy to grow, even if you're growing all these three here. So this here is critical. And where a lot of developing countries fall behind is on this institution. So they don't have the, or at least it's not at the same level as we have in the developed world. The banking system or the legal system and so on. Does the economic growth lead to economic development? Does higher GDP per capita lead to better living standards? What's your view? Well, my view is yes, it does, but it's not always. It's not just as simple as boost GDP and then have better living standards. The example, we can go and next when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we will look at the US GDP per capita and try to work out why are they not, the healthiest country in the world. Well, it's because of other challenges. Do higher rates of economic growth mean an improvement in country welfare? It can, but what if this comes at the cost of huge levels of pollution? So your factories produce more and more, but you pollute more and more. Does your country welfare necessarily go up? Maybe not. Does higher government revenue lead to better provision of essential services such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure? Well, higher government revenue gives you the potential to better provide these essential services, but doesn't always be the case because sometimes governments spend money on pet projects or on military or something like that. Does economic growth increase inequality? And here I would say it shouldn't have to, but it certainly seems like it does. So this is where we're getting a lot of, even when we're getting good economic growth figures in the developed world, all over the world, we've seen rapid increase in inequality in the last few years. Economic growth doesn't have to increase inequality. We could have some good redistribution schemes and so on, but it definitely does seem to be doing so. Does economic growth lead to an increase in externalities or a lack of sustainability? And again, like all these questions, the answer is there's no definite answer, but for this one, it doesn't have to. But the way we run our economy, it tends to do so. Uneconomic growth, when increases of production come at an expense in resources and well-being that is more than the items made. So if you look at page 335 in your textbook, they talk about, and then you can watch this video as well, but they talk about negative externalities and lack of sustainability. So, you know, again, this is, I mean, it focuses on, we're producing, we ignore the external costs. I mean, challenges, I mean, many parts of the world, we still don't have safe water, you know, and I don't know, you guys, Flint, Michigan in the US is a famous city where they have terrible water. And then on your textbook on page 335, they talk about some of the consequences when we have this uneconomic growth. So they talk about things like the access to safe water becoming more precarious, tropical diseases spreading, droughts, food production being damaged, and rising sea levels. And again, we'll talk more about this when we look at the SDGs as well. Now we'll just move on and talk about characteristics of developing countries. So we split this into two. For developing countries, there's some characteristics that most of them seem to share, and then there's some characteristics that are unique, or there's a lot of diversity among developing countries. So generally speaking, what's a developing country? Low income, inequality, poor health, and inadequate education. Most developing countries will fit that, at least compared to the developed world. They'll have low standards of living, low incomes. So the low standard of living, and this is characterized by the low income, inequality, poor health, and inadequate education. Low levels of productivity, because remember, developing countries, they might have labor working with very little capital. So very little machinery and so on. So this makes it very difficult to be productive. A lot of developing countries, this is the challenge, the population growing very, very fast, and the dependency burden growing fast as well. So basically, what do we mean by dependency burden? The amount of very, very young people in society who are not able to work yet as a share of the total population. So if your population is growing very, very fast, yeah, you have this very high dependency burden, and we see this a lot in developing countries. High and rising levels of unemployment and underemployment. So yeah, developing countries, it's difficult to create jobs, difficult to create sustainable jobs. It's also very difficult well, a lot of times people are working in jobs where really, you know, it's not really a full job. You know, you have maybe, for example, I remember going to Azerbaijan a few years ago to see a football match, and you know, to get a taxi, there'd be like two guys would approach you, and then there'd be another guy driving and another guy, you know, with him in the car. You know, it was like four people basically driving a taxi. That's underemployment. Like they were all earning money from my taxi fare, but you know, really you didn't. Of course, you only needed one person to drive the car. And then substantial dependence on agricultural production and primary products. So developing countries tend to focus more on agricultural and commodities, primary product exports. And this is a challenge because these goods tend to have less value add, and their prices tend to be tend to fluctuate a lot in the market, and the developing countries have very little power over these prices. And then the last one on the imperfect information and limited limited information. Essentially, what we're saying here is that markets don't tend to work as good in these countries. And the last point then is they're basically up against it in the world markets. So they basically they struggle. I mean, a lot of these countries, they are former colonies. They have a lot of debt. They owe a lot of money to the financial system and so on. They don't tend to be treated like equals in the international relations. And then this last one, I'll let you guys just go through this yourself. If this covers page 339. If you read page 339 and 340, diversity among developing countries, essentially, you know, we use this broad term developing countries, but the reality is they're so diverse. It's most of the world, definitely most of the world in population, most of the world in area too, probably. And they're all these here are just different ways of saying it's a very, very diverse group of countries. So I recommend, just to get a head start, you guys just look up this Human Development Index. We'll talk about this a bit later. It's basically saying, remember we talked about GDP not being a great measure and so on for capturing development. This is an alternative. And, you know, you can see why living standards are higher in some countries. You can see how the dependency rate compares in developing versus developed countries, and also the unemployment rate. So have a look at that there. And then, you know, think about these questions here. These are potential exam questions. And of course, we need to think about how we're going to handle development for the exam, because it's essentially, we don't expect to see exam questions like this because they're reducing the size of the exam. But development does come into account sometimes in international trade. So it's good to have an overview of it before the exam. But have a look, but just be thinking about these questions here, and they're just a basic revision of what we did. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I will end for today.